He simply gave up his seat to an elderly woman in business class, but what she did later turned his life upside down. Watch until the end and write in the comments which country you are from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Elijah Robinson had never flown first class before. In truth, he had never flown at all. Airplanes were distant, abstract things that roared overhead while he walked home from the corner store or biked to the public library. They were not for boys like him, raised on grits and grit, whose childhood dinners were cooked on a hot plate while his mother worked night shifts wiping down hospital floors. The idea of being on a plane, let alone in a leather seat that folded into a bed, had once felt like science fiction. But that was before the letter arrived. It came in a simple white envelope bearing the blue seal of the Global Future Tech Initiative, one of those organizations that most people assumed were too lofty, too international, too distant from real life to touch someone like him. Yet somehow he had won. A full scholarship to attend their Global Impact and Innovation Conference in Zurich. They would cover travel, accommodation, meals, everything. And, in a detail that still made his breath catch, the plane ticket was for business class. He had read the letter 3 times before calling his mother. She had answered in her usual voice, tired but warm, and when he told her the news there was a pause. Then came the sound of quiet sobbing. He didn't cry, not out loud, but his throat tightened and he stared at the words on the paper until they blurred. He spent the next week preparing, both excited and afraid. He visited the thrift store to buy a suit, gray, a little baggy in the shoulders, and had it tailored by an old neighbor who used to sew uniforms for the local high school band. He polished his 1 pair of dress shoes and packed his things carefully into a modest black suitcase. He borrowed a friend's second-hand laptop to double-check his presentation slides and downloaded a German phrasebook to his phone. It was his first time out of the country, and he intended to honor it. The night before his departure, he couldn't sleep. His mind ran in loops about the conference, about making a fool of himself, about sitting next to men and women who probably had trust funds and startup portfolios. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked around his small apartment. It was clean but bare. A single plant sat in the windowsill. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. On the wall above his desk hung a framed photograph of his mother holding him as a baby in front of the community center where she used to volunteer. He stared at it, then whispered, "I'll make it count." The next morning, he kissed her goodbye at the front door. She held him a little longer than necessary and slipped a folded napkin into his bag. Inside was a sandwich and a note. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. Love you, Mom. He arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport 3 hours early, his palms sweating as he navigated the terminals. The business class check-in area felt like a dream. Quiet. Padded chairs, no lines, no shouting children or overflowing carry-ons. A woman in a navy suit offered him a warm smile and a chilled towel. It took everything in him not to flinch when she addressed him as Mr. Robinson. When he reached the security checkpoint, he pulled out his carefully packed laptop and passport, nodding politely to every officer. His heart raced as he stepped through the scanner, but the light turned green and no alarm sounded. He exhaled and allowed himself a small smile. The lounge was even more surreal. Soft lighting, leather armchairs, and rows of glass jars filled with almonds and gourmet pretzels. There were showers and sleeping pods, and a coffee machine that responded to touch. He watched a man in a tailored suit sip espresso while scrolling through emails on a tablet the size of a book. Elijah sat down in a corner with his bottled water and tried not to look out of place. He checked the time. 2 hours until boarding. He opened his laptop, reviewed his itinerary again, and reread his opening paragraph. His project was about using low-code platforms to teach underserved youth in American cities to build mobile apps. Nothing flashy, but real, tangible. Something he had built with students he mentored after work. It had already helped 2 girls get internships. That was enough. Finally, his flight was called. He followed the signs to Gate C12, his ticket clutched in his hand like a passport to another world. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass and smiled. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Robinson," she said. The jet bridge was cold and industrial. He stepped onto the plane and was greeted by a flight attendant with perfectly styled hair and a crisp accent. "Right this way," she said, guiding him toward the front. His seat, 3A, was by the window, cocooned in privacy. It had a curved shell, a large screen, a side table, and a button panel that looked like something from a spaceship. There was a blanket, sealed in plastic, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. A menu sat on the armrest, listing things like roasted lamb loin and Belgian moose. He sat down slowly, as though afraid the seat might vanish. It didn't. Instead, it molded to him like memory foam. He reached for the safety card and pretended to study it, though his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the vast tarmac beyond. Passengers continued to file in, mostly men and women in tailored suits, some already deep in conversation. Elijah kept to himself, smiled politely when someone made eye contact, and kept his hands on his lap. He heard someone order champagne, another ask for a gluten-free option. Every detail was surreal. The flight attendant offered him a warm towel. He took it, wiping his hands slowly, unsure of the protocol. She asked if he'd like anything to drink before takeoff. He hesitated. "Just water, please." As she turned away, he let out a long breath. It was happening. He was here. He had done it. Maybe just this once, he could allow himself to believe he belonged. The engines began to hum. The doors closed. The captain's voice came on, crisp and calm, welcoming them aboard their flight from Atlanta to Zurich, with an estimated time of 9 hours and 40 minutes. Outside, the ground crew waved as the plane backed away from the gate. Elijah adjusted his seatbelt and looked down at the tiny map on the screen. A red line traced the journey across the Atlantic. He leaned back slightly, fingers resting on the armrest. He tried to imagine the view of the Alps from above. Then he thought of his students, their questions, their curiosity. He thought of his mother, probably asleep by now, trusting that her son was flying safely into a future they had both dared to believe in. He smiled. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. He closed his eyes, bracing for the moment when the wheels would lift, when gravity would let go, and the world would unfold beneath him like a map, full of possibilities waiting to be traced. He had no idea yet that the most important moment of this journey wouldn't come during the conference or in the marble halls of Zurich's innovation centers, but in the narrow aisle of this plane, when a quiet act of compassion would redefine the very meaning of success. But for now, he flew, unaware of what the air held in store. The plane had been in the air for less than 20 minutes when Elijah began to notice the change. The hum of the engines was steady, the lights had dimmed to a soft glow, and most of the business class passengers were already reclining, sipping drinks or tapping on tablets. Elijah had reclined only slightly. His mind was still too alert, too aware of his surroundings. The takeoff had been smooth, the sky outside endless and blue, but something in him refused to settle. Perhaps it was the unfamiliarity of it all, the sheer luxury, the quiet, the fact that he was so far removed from everything he had known. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through the in-flight entertainment menu, hovering over documentaries and dramas, unsure what mood he was in. Then he heard it. First faintly, then clearer. A series of subtle, uneven taps against the floor. Not loud, but sharp enough to catch attention. He glanced up, instinctively turning toward the source. From the rear of the cabin, the curtain between business and economy had been drawn back momentarily, and through it emerged a flight attendant, guiding someone slowly, carefully. Elijah squinted, then sat forward as he took in the sight. An elderly woman, stooped and frail, was making her way down the aisle, one trembling hand gripping a walker that clicked rhythmically with each step. She was dressed in a simple cream blouse and a faded cotton skirt that swayed slightly as she moved. Her white head wrap, perfectly tied, framed a face lined with time, deep grooves around her mouth and eyes, the skin paper-thin and translucent. Her steps were slow, uncertain. With each one, her knees seemed to buckle ever so slightly, and her shoulders hunched forward as though bracing against some invisible weight. Elijah watched, a sense of unease stirring in his chest. Something about the image unsettled him, not just the woman's age, but the way she seemed unanchored, vulnerable, like a leaf in the wind. The flight attendant at her side was speaking gently, reassuringly, but the woman's face remained tense. Her eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for something or someone familiar. But there was only confusion, isolation. Passengers seated in the business section began to take notice. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman peered over her reading glasses. Someone muttered something under their breath, not unkindly, but with that quiet irritation reserved for disruptions. Elijah noticed how no one moved. No one offered help. No one stood. The atmosphere held a strange stiffness, a collective pause, as if waiting for the moment to pass so things could return to normal. He looked to the flight attendant again, who gently placed a hand on the woman's elbow. "Ma'am," she said, "your seat is just a few rows back." The woman, still clutching her walker, shook her head faintly. Her lips moved, but Elijah couldn't make out the words. Whatever she said, it was an agreement. Then something shifted in her posture. She turned her head slightly, looking down the length of the plane toward the rear. Elijah followed her gaze. Row after row of narrow economy seats stretched toward the tail, where the engines roared louder, where the lights were dimmer and spaced tighter. He saw the anxiety in her face, how her eyes widened ever so slightly, how her mouth trembled. She whispered something again to the attendant. This time, her voice carried a threadbare whisper of protest. "I can't make it that far." The attendant looked stricken, unsure. Elijah could see her dilemma. She was trying to follow protocol, but the woman clearly wasn't well. Her steps were already faltering. Her breath came in shallow pulls. The walker clacked against the aisle floor with each uncertain movement. For a long moment, Elijah did nothing. His hands rested on his knees, his back straight against the plush seat. His heart pounded louder than before, not from nerves, but from a heavy and sudden sense of recognition. He had seen this kind of exhaustion before, in his mother's face after a double shift, in the quiet sigh of the grandmother who used to babysit him when he was small. It was the look of a body on the verge of surrender. He glanced around again. No one was moving. Not a single passenger had risen. A man across from him shifted uncomfortably, but remained seated. Another picked up his phone, pretending to be absorbed in it. The woman's knees bent slightly. She wavered. For a terrifying moment, Elijah thought she might fall right there in the aisle. That was when he stood. He didn't plan it. There was no grand thought, no inner speech. His body simply moved, as if some quiet voice inside had finally shouted loud enough. He stepped into the aisle, catching the attention of the flight attendant. Her expression shifted, half surprised, half relieved. "I can switch with her," he said simply. The woman blinked. "Sir?" Elijah nodded toward the elderly woman, whose eyes now met his. "She can have my seat, please. She can't make it back there." The attendant hesitated, clearly flustered. "Sir, this is business class. Your seat is—" "I know," he said. "It's just a seat." Passengers began to whisper. Someone in the front row scoffed softly, but Elijah didn't care. The flight attendant nodded slowly, then turned to the woman. "This gentleman would like you to take his seat, ma'am." The old woman looked at Elijah for a long second. Her eyes searched his, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she gave a single, grateful nod. He helped guide her to his seat, adjusting the blanket, placing her walker beside the seat where the crew secured it. She lowered herself with difficulty, her limbs trembling but determined. When she finally sat, her hands settled in her lap, and her breathing steadied. Elijah stepped back, giving her space. The attendant offered her a cup of warm tea. She took it with both hands, nodding her thanks. Without another word, Elijah turned and walked slowly down the aisle, his suitcase still overhead in 3A, his assigned spot no longer his. The further he went, the more the plane seemed to narrow. The air grew warmer, the lights harsher. By the time he reached row 51, he felt like he had stepped into another world entirely. His new seat was in the very last row next to the lavatory. It was a window seat, but the window was smudged and the frame rattled slightly. The tray table stuck when he pulled it down. The man beside him, already dozing, smelled faintly of cologne and something fried. The woman on the aisle had her shoes off. Elijah sat down slowly, adjusting his posture to fit into the cramped space. He exhaled. There was no pillow, no champagne, no screen, and yet, somehow, he didn't mind. He rested his head against the cold pane of glass and stared out into the blue. Behind him, the engines roared. Ahead, an old woman sat in comfort. And somewhere, deep in his chest, Elijah felt something quiet and unfamiliar settle into place. A sense of rightness. It was just a seat, but maybe, just maybe, it was also something more. The hum of the engines became a steady lullaby, though the cramped seat made it hard for Elijah to find comfort. The tray table in front of him bore the marks of age and use, a faint ring of a past soda can, the ghost of stickers someone had peeled off without care. Around him, economy class bustled with quiet life, the rustle of snack wrappers, the occasional cough, the soft clicks of seatbelt buckles. The smell of reheated meals hung in the air, greasy, artificial, and oddly nostalgic. Elijah leaned back as far as his rigid seat would allow, folding his arms across his chest and closing his eyes, trying not to think about the plush recliner he had surrendered. He could still remember how it cradled him, how the leather yielded beneath him, how the silence there had felt almost holy. But that memory no longer brought resentment. If anything, it brought peace. He had not expected to feel this calm. At first, there had been tension, a quiet worry that someone might chastise him, that the flight crew would tell him it wasn't allowed, that other passengers might make a scene. But no one had said anything. No one had even thanked him. That, too, didn't matter. He hadn't done it for applause. In fact, The idea of being praised for something that had felt so instinctive embarrassed him. He shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to bump the dozing man beside him, and glanced over his shoulder toward the front of the plane. He couldn't see her. His former seat now hidden by a curtain and the long stretch of rows between, but he pictured her there, settled at last. He imagined her sipping her tea, her breathing slow and even, her frail frame finally at rest. That image warmed him more than any fleece blanket could have. He pulled out his phone, not to check messages since the connection was off, but to open the Notes app. There, beneath a dozen bullet points about his conference presentation, he tapped out a simple line. Some things are worth more than comfort. Then he locked the screen and slipped the device back into his pocket. The hours crawled by. Flight attendants came through with carts of meals. Elijah accepted the tray without interest, peeled back the foil lid, and stared down at a portion of chicken that looked vaguely edible. He picked at it without appetite. Halfway through, the woman on the aisle offered him a biscuit from a small plastic bag. "It's homemade," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. He accepted it with a nod. It was sweet and crumbly, flavored with cinnamon and something else he couldn't place. For a moment, it reminded him of Saturdays in his mother's kitchen, when she used to bake cornbread from scratch and sing along to the oldies on the radio. "Not many people would have done what you did," the woman said softly. Elijah didn't answer right away. He chewed slowly, then wiped his fingers on the napkin. "I didn't think about it," he said. "It just felt right." She smiled and returned to her book as if satisfied with his answer. Night fell somewhere over the Atlantic. The cabin lights dimmed and silence took hold. Only the occasional cry of a baby or the sound of someone shifting in their seat disturbed the hush. Elijah tried to sleep but couldn't. His legs cramped easily, his head lolled against the vibrating wall. He gave up eventually and simply watched the darkness outside the window, stars scattered across an endless canvas. He thought about what had led him here, how a boy from the South Side, raised by a woman who worked herself sick to keep him fed, had somehow ended up in a metal bird flying over oceans. He thought about the students he taught in his after-school program, how their eyes lit up when they figured out how to make a button change colors on a screen. He thought about what it meant to be given something rare, like a business class ticket, and what it meant to give it up. In the stillness of that long night, the world outside shrunk to the width of an airplane fuselage, and within it, Elijah found himself face to face with a kind of clarity he hadn't expected. He had always thought success was something measurable, an award, a salary, a title. But maybe it was simpler. Maybe it was in seeing someone else breathe easier because of your choice. Maybe it was in doing the thing you didn't plan to do but couldn't walk away from. Eventually, he drifted off, if only for a short time. When he woke, his neck was stiff, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet. Breakfast service had begun. A tray appeared in front of him with a croissant, a small container of yogurt, and fruit that looked suspiciously like it had been sliced days ago. He ate a little, sipped juice, and checked the flight map. They were nearing Europe. The seatbelt sign blinked on again. The captain's voice came through, announcing their descent into Zurich. Passengers stirred, stretching, brushing sleep from their eyes. Elijah sat upright, adjusting his seatbelt and rubbing his eyes. The woman next to him offered a tissue, and he accepted it with a grateful nod. He didn't rush. There was no need. Unlike the others, he had nothing urgent waiting beyond the arrival gate. No town car, no pre-booked meetings, no welcome committee. He only had his presentation materials and a promise he had made to his students to take pictures of the snow-covered streets if he saw any. When the plane touched down, there was a soft cheer somewhere in the back. A baby cried. Overhead, bins clicked open. Elijah stayed seated, waiting for the rows in front to clear. As he finally stood and stretched his legs, he felt a dull ache in his knees. The cabin lights were bright now, artificial daylight flooding the narrow aisles. He stepped out slowly, pulling his backpack from the overhead bin, and began to shuffle forward with the line. When he reached the curtain separating economy from business class, he paused. For a moment, he considered walking straight on, letting the past hours remain a quiet memory. But something tugged at him. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. He peeked through the opening, half expecting the seat to be empty. But it wasn't. She was awake now, the elderly woman. She sat calmly, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her posture slightly straighter than before. A flight attendant stood nearby collecting used cups. The old woman turned her head slowly, and their eyes met. Elijah was startled by the clarity in her gaze. There was no confusion now, no uncertainty, only a quiet recognition. She smiled gently and motioned to the seat beside her. He hesitated, then stepped inside the curtain, careful not to draw attention. She patted the seat. "Come," her expression seemed to say. "Sit." He glanced around. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. He sat down beside her, the cushions still warm. The difference in comfort was stark. He noticed it immediately. But what struck him more was her presence. It was steady, grounded, commanding in a way that was difficult to explain. She reached into a faded handbag on her lap and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her grip was sure. She handed it to him without a word. Elijah took it, unfolding the creased sheet carefully. It was a letterhead. Official. The name at the top was one he recognized, though he wasn't sure from where. And at the bottom, a signature. He looked up at her, eyes wide. "You're—" he began. She nodded, lips forming the faintest smile, but she said nothing. Not yet. He looked down again, then back at her. Something stirred in him, something he couldn't name just yet, but that would take root and grow, changing everything. In that moment, he didn't feel like a passenger on a plane anymore. He felt like a man who had just stepped into the story of his life. The first light of morning was creeping across the Zurich skyline, casting soft golden streaks over the airport's tarmac and into the windows of the plane as it sat quietly at the gate. Most of the passengers were already gone, the cabin nearly emptied of voices and motion. The aisle lay open, quiet now except for the distant rustle of flight attendants cleaning up and the hum of the engines slowly powering down. Yet Elijah remained seated beside the elderly woman in 3A, a silent moment lingering between them that neither seemed eager to break. He was still holding the document she had given him. It trembled slightly in his hands, not from turbulence or temperature, but from the slow realization dawning in his chest. He had read the name, Dr. Elizabeth Holloway, and at first it had triggered only the faintest ripple of recognition, like hearing a melody without knowing the song. But as his eyes scanned the printed details, his memory began to stitch it together. He had seen a televised awards ceremony the year before, something his mother had watched late one night. He remembered the standing ovation, the soft-spoken woman with a cane accepting the honor for decades of humanitarian work. Clinics in war zones, education programs in forgotten regions, mediation between communities that hadn't spoken in generations. Her face had changed, aged further perhaps, but the weight in her gaze was unmistakable. It was her. He looked at her now, searching her face for some sign that this was all a trick or an exaggeration, but there was nothing in her eyes but quiet truth. Her lips curved slightly, acknowledging the weight of the moment, not with pride, but with something gentler. Acceptance, perhaps. The way a tree accepts the years that pass over it, or a river accepts the bend in its path. You're Dr. Holloway," Elijah said at last, his voice more breath than sound. She nodded, her hands still folded neatly over her lap. "I used to be," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "Now I'm mostly bones and memory." He blinked, unsure how to respond. The gravity of who she was pressed against his chest, mixing with the disbelief that someone so renowned had been sitting behind him, unnoticed by nearly everyone, nearly unassisted. He looked again at the letterhead, then back to her. "I didn't know," he said, a flush of embarrassment rising in his face. "You weren't supposed to," she replied, eyes twinkling. "That's what made it real." There was a silence that settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence full of meaning, a shared recognition that some moments didn't require decoration. Elijah breathed in slowly, letting the reality of the situation sink into his bones. She turned slightly in her seat, her frame small, but somehow still commanding. "Do you know why I was sitting back there?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Because I wanted to disappear for a while," she said, her gaze drifting out the window toward the rising sun. "I've spent the last 40 years speaking for people who weren't heard, fighting for the invisible. I've been in rooms with presidents, walked through hospitals with no roofs, argued with ministers in places where women aren't allowed to speak at all. But lately—" She paused and her hands tightened slightly around the fabric of her skirt. "Lately, I've felt like my own voice was becoming part of the noise. I needed to go back to where I started, quietly, as just a woman, not as a name." Elijah listened, not daring to interrupt. "But my body," she continued, "no longer listens to my pride. I thought I could make it, that I could sit there, endure the discomfort, because I didn't want anyone to notice me. But I couldn't. I was wrong. I was foolish." Her eyes met his again. "Then you came, and you gave up your seat without knowing who I was. You didn't ask questions. You didn't expect thanks. You just acted." He felt something catch in his throat. "It just felt right," he said again, almost to himself. She studied him for a long time, and he felt himself measured, not judged, but weighed with a kind of insight he wasn't used to. Then she reached into the small leather notebook tucked between her seat and the armrest. The leather was worn, cracked around the corners, but carefully maintained. She opened it, flipped to a page filled with narrow, handwritten lines, then paused, tore one sheet out with precision, and folded it carefully. "I don't give these out often," she said, sliding it into his palm. "Only 3 a year." Elijah opened it slowly. On the inside, in elegant script, were the words, "Lifelong access to the Holloway Global Trust. Any project, any need. Justify the purpose, and we will fund the person." Below that, her personal contact number and a wax seal embossed in the paper. He stared at it in disbelief, the magnitude of the gift crashing into him like a tide. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "You don't even have to use it. But if you ever find yourself tired of chasing numbers, use it to chase meaning." He nodded slowly, fingers tightening around the paper. "I don't deserve this." Her smile was kind but unwavering. "You already earned it." Another silence passed between them. Outside the window, ground crew vehicles moved across the runway, bright orange vests glinting in the morning light. The world was waking up. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing final disembarkation procedures. Dr. Holloway adjusted her shawl, her movements precise but slow. "I'll be a while getting off," she said. "You should go ahead." He hesitated. "I don't mind waiting." She shook her head, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "No, go. I like watching people carry more than they realize." He stood reluctantly, tucking the folded paper into the inside pocket of his jacket as if it were something sacred. His steps down the aisle were slower than before. He moved through the empty rows with a different posture, no longer hunched with nervousness but upright, steady, quiet with thought. The terminal was busy again, alive with the shuffle of footsteps and the low rumble of rolling luggage. But Elijah didn't hear the noise in the same way he had when he first arrived. Something about the world had shifted, or maybe it was him. Waiting at the arrivals gate was a woman holding a small sign that read, "Mr. Elijah Robinson, GFTI Delegate." She smiled when she saw him. "Dr. Holloway said to expect you," she said brightly. "We're so glad you're here, shall we?" He nodded mutely and followed her, still clutching his backpack. They moved through the terminal toward a waiting vehicle. As they drove into the city, past bridges and glittering rivers and rows of trees just beginning to bloom, he barely registered the scenery. He was thinking about the card in his pocket. He was thinking about his students. He was thinking about the moment he had given something up and received more than he could ever have imagined in return. He was thinking, finally, about what came next. And for the first time in his life, he felt like the answer was his to write. The streets of Zurich passed by in a blur as Elijah sat in the back seat of the sleek black sedan, still cradling his backpack on his lap like a shield. The city around him was waking, and everything seemed pristine. Clean sidewalks, the scent of morning bread from unseen bakeries, the quiet orderliness of early European light. But Elijah wasn't noticing any of it in detail. His mind remained rooted in the moments that had just passed, and the gravity of the paper nestled against his chest, and the echo of Dr. Holloway's voice as she said, "You already earned it." He had felt something shift inside him the moment she had spoken those words. It wasn't pride. It wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper, a reckoning. The car eased along the cobbled roads and came to a gentle stop outside a modern hotel nestled between two old-world buildings. The woman who had met him at the airport stepped out first and opened his door with practiced grace. She welcomed him again, reminded him gently of the conference schedule, and told him that breakfast would be available in the executive lounge. He nodded, thanked her, and carried his things inside. At the reception desk, another smiling woman addressed him by name before he even reached the counter. "Mr. Robinson, your room is ready," she said, handing him a key card with the hotel's gold emblem. "Dr. Holloway asked us to ensure you had a corner suite. Welcome to Zurich." He blinked. A suite? The elevator ride to the 9th floor was silent except for the whispering of smooth mechanics and the distant hum of city life below. When the doors opened, he stepped into a carpeted hallway and found his room. The suite was light-filled and spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Limmat River. There was a writing desk made of oak, a bed so wide it could sleep three, and a welcome gift of Swiss chocolates on the table with his name on a small card. But even here, even in this comfort, Elijah felt no urge to celebrate. He placed his backpack down with care, removed his jacket, and sat on the edge of the bed. His hand slipped inside the inner pocket and retrieved the folded page. He unfolded it again, reading the words slowly. Lifelong access to the Holloway Global Trust. Any project, any need. Justify the purpose and we will fund the person. It was a key. No, it was a door, a bridge, a responsibility. He stared at it for several minutes, then reached for the hotel notepad and began to write. Names poured onto the page first: Amari, Samir, Layla, Tasha, his students from the community center back home. He thought of their curious questions, their clever bug fixes, their frustration when the Wi-Fi lagged. He wrote "after school code" across the top of the page and circled it 3 times. Then he began outlining what had always lived quietly in the back of his mind. A full-time youth tech program for underserved kids, not just in Atlanta, but maybe other cities too. A place where they could learn, build, and dream, with real machines, real mentorship, real belief. He wrote for hours through the check-in calls from conference coordinators and the gentle knock of housekeeping at the door. He skipped the executive breakfast and the welcome reception. His fingers were ink-stained by noon. He missed the city tour and the networking lunch. None of it mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was that he could finally build something that didn't just elevate him, but lifted others with him. That evening, he sent his first email to the Holloway Foundation using the personal contact listed on the card. He introduced himself humbly, attached a brief outline of his idea, and ended with a single line: "I want to build something that helps the kids who remind me of me." Then he shut his laptop, placed it on the desk, and took his first deep breath of the day. The next morning, the conference began. Elijah, dressed in his second-hand suit and cleanest shirt, walked into a room filled with the polished professionals, tech leaders, and visionary thinkers. At first, he felt the familiar edge of anxiety tug at his nerves. But when he began his presentation, his voice was steady. He didn't speak with flash or flair. He spoke with clarity, with experience, with quiet fire. He showed pictures of his students' early apps, buggy, colorful, beautiful in their intent. He spoke about the gaps they faced, the need for tools and trust, and the joy of seeing a child light up when they realize they've built something that works. When he finished, the room was still. Then came applause, not thunderous but genuine. A few people approached him afterward asking for more information, offering business cards, complimenting his vision. One woman from a London-based incubator offered to mentor him on scaling the idea. Another man suggested a possible collaboration with an educational platform in Johannesburg, but none of it compared to what he found waiting in his inbox that night. The email bore the Holloway Foundation's emblem. It was brief but decisive. "We have reviewed your concept and believe in its potential. Dr. Holloway personally requests that this be your first grant under the trust. Please expect follow-up from our senior advisor team. Congratulations, Mr. Robinson, and thank you for remembering why we build." He reread the message twice, then once more. His heart beat harder, not with pride, but with a strange and beautiful responsibility. He wasn't just being supported, he was being trusted. He called his mother from the suite phone. She picked up quickly, the line crackling slightly. "Zurich, treating you well?" she asked. He smiled. "More than I ever expected." There was a pause. "You sound different." "I think I am," he said softly. "Are you staying safe? Eating?" "Trying to," he chuckled. "But Ma, I think something big is starting." "You'll make it matter," she said without hesitation. "You always do." After the call, Elijah stood by the window, watching the lights of the city shimmer across the water. He pressed his forehead gently against the cool glass and allowed himself to feel it all. The disbelief, the weight, the spark. Back home, he threw himself into work. Once the funds were formally transferred, he leased a modest space near the community center. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a shared hallway, but it had working outlets, a lock on the door, and enough space for 12 desks. He painted the walls himself, dragging rollers up and down until the dingy beige transformed into a vibrant blue. The furniture was donated, the laptops refurbished. He recruited 2 friends from college to volunteer on weekends, and soon the first batch of students returned. Amari, Samir, Layla, Tasha, and more came after them. He called it the Holloway Center, though he never mentioned her to the students. He didn't want them to admire the name. He wanted them to believe in themselves. Months passed, the program grew, word spread. A local newspaper ran a piece on him. An educational nonprofit reached out to collaborate. A group of parents brought him dinner every Friday just to say thank you. But Elijah kept his head down, focused on the mission. He remembered the walker, the trembling hands, the silence of a plane cabin, and the seat he had given up without knowing he was stepping into a new life. One afternoon, as he cleaned the whiteboard at the end of class, his phone buzzed. It was an email. Subject line, Elizabeth Holloway. His heart stopped. He opened it slowly. It was from her assistant. The message was simple. Dr. Holloway wishes to commend you on your extraordinary first project. She asks that you not let this be the last. Attached was a scanned note, handwritten in looping script. You reminded me who I used to be, and in doing so, reminded me who I still am. Thank you. Elijah sat down, the marker still in his hand, the board half wiped. He looked at the note, then around the room, at the desks, the posters, the photos on the walls. And, for the first time since Zurich, he let himself cry. Not from sadness, from purpose. Autumn came quietly to Atlanta, its arrival marked not by dramatic winds or sudden storms, but by the soft turning of leaves and the mellow light that settled on every sidewalk. Elijah walked each morning from his apartment to the Holloway Center, a canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder, always filled with the same items: his laptop, a worn leather notebook, a USB drive containing lesson plans, and a photograph of his mother tucked into the side pocket. The building he entered every day was still small, unassuming from the outside, its windows smudged from eager fingerprints and its door sometimes squeaky. But within, something remarkable was unfolding. Word of the Holloway Center had spread farther than Elijah had expected. What began as a pilot program for a handful of middle school students now included multiple age groups. His students were building apps that solved real problems, organizing food drives, helping elders schedule medical visits, and even creating a neighborhood alert system. More importantly, they had begun to believe they were capable of shaping the world around them. Elijah no longer needed to convince them of their value. They saw it with each line of code they wrote. The grant from the Holloway Foundation had been enough to cover their first year. Equipment, stipends for part-time instructors, even internet upgrades. But it wasn't the money that had kept them going. It was the growing sense of ownership among the students and the quiet, unshakable standard Elijah set. His presence wasn't loud. He wasn't the type to dominate a room. But he was steady, reliable, intentional. His calm was magnetic, especially to the kids who came from chaos. He kept his promise to never use Dr. Holloway's name to elevate his own. The card she had given him still lay folded in the same jacket pocket, the ink slightly faded, corners soft from being handled. Occasionally, he would reread her note, the words written in her own hand, and allow himself to remember the moment on the plane, the warm light in her eyes, the weight of her trust. But he didn't speak of it. He carried it like a compass, invisible but ever present. Months passed, and with them came change. A second location was opened in a neighboring district thanks to a community partnership. One of Elijah's former students, now in high school, was brought on as a teaching assistant. A local teacher requested a collaboration with the public school system. A retired engineer volunteered to teach robotics. The walls of the center filled with photographs, smiling faces, messy whiteboards, posters celebrating each small milestone. In the hallway near Elijah's office, a mural took shape, painted by one of the parents. It showed a young tree growing from a cracked sidewalk, its branches stretching skyward, coded symbols embedded into the roots. Then, one gray Thursday in November, a letter arrived. It was a large envelope, thick, with the Holloway Foundation emblem embossed in gold. Elijah recognized it immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a letter on formal stationery and a smaller envelope sealed in wax. The letter was from the Foundation's board. It informed him, with deep sorrow, that Dr. Elizabeth Holloway had passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home in Geneva. She had been surrounded by family and staff, her final days spent in quiet comfort. She had spoken often of her past, they wrote, and of one story in particular. The story of a young man on a flight from Atlanta who had given up his seat with no knowledge of who she was. A story she had recounted not as an anecdote, but as a turning point. A moment that reminded her of who she still was beneath the titles and awards. Enclosed, they said, was a copy of the section of her will in which he was mentioned. Elijah opened the smaller envelope and unfolded the page. There, in her own handwriting again, was a final note, to Elijah Robinson. He reminded me that even in a world grown noisy with ambition and image, a single, quiet act of kindness can still echo the loudest. He gave without needing to know who I was. In doing so, he reminded me who I still am. Let this be part of my legacy. Elijah sat for a long time in silence after reading those words. He stared at the letter, his thumb resting on the edge of the page, tracing the curve of her signature. Around him, the center buzzed faintly with life. Students tapping on keyboards, laughter echoing from the next room, the gentle hum of ideas being born. But he remained still, overwhelmed not with grief, but with a profound sense of continuity. He had not merely honored her legacy, he had become part of it. That evening, he called his mother and read the note to her. She didn't say anything for several moments. Then, softly, she said, "You changed her, but she changed you too, didn't she?" He nodded, though she couldn't see him. More than I knew. Days later, the board of the Holloway Foundation invited him to Geneva for a memorial event. They wanted him to speak. He declined. Instead, he held a small gathering at the center. Students, parents, neighbors, volunteers, anyone who had been touched by the work they were doing. He didn't mention Dr. Holloway by name. Instead, he told them a story about giving up a seat and what it taught him. He told them about listening when the world is silent and acting when no one is watching. He ended simply, "Sometimes we don't know how far a single decision will carry us, but we must make it anyway." Later, one of the students approached him quietly. A seventh-grade girl with quiet eyes and a strong mind. She said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." He knelt beside her. "Don't," he said. "Be better. Be louder. Go further." She nodded solemnly. "I will." That night, Elijah walked through the center one last time before locking up. He passed the mural, the classroom, the storage closet filled with spare cords and old monitors. In the main room, a single light was still on. On the whiteboard, someone had written in purple marker, "Thank you, Mr. Robinson." He smiled, turned off the light, and stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the pavement. He stepped out, pulled the door shut behind him, and walked slowly home beneath the autumn sky, not as a man seeking his place in the world, but as one who had found it and given it away, so others might find theirs too. Spring came to Atlanta not with fireworks or grandeur, but with a quiet certainty. The dogwoods bloomed along cracked sidewalks, the air carried the scent of damp soil and fresh-cut grass, and the sun stretched longer into each day. On a warm morning in late March, Elijah stood in front of a crowd gathered under a white canvas tent outside the newly renovated Holloway Center for Youth Innovation. He wore a navy suit that fit him better than his first one, though it was still modest, and he held a piece of paper folded twice in his hand, but he had no intention of reading from it. The ceremony had already begun. A local councilwoman had spoken first, offering words about the city's pride in its young people, about the role of mentorship in transforming futures. Then came the director of the Holloway Foundation's Southeast Branch, who presented a plaque honoring the memory of Dr. Elizabeth Holloway. The crowd, composed of parents, students, volunteers, community leaders, and former grant recipients, listened attentively. There was polite applause, a few respectful tears. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he stepped forward slowly, his gaze scanning the group. Among them were faces he had known for years. Amari, now applying for college, stood beside her younger brother who had just joined the robotics club. Mrs. Jenkins from the PTA waved at him discreetly. His mother, seated in the front row, beamed with quiet pride, dabbing her eyes with a cloth handkerchief. Elijah took a breath and set the folded paper down on the podium. "I thought about preparing something formal," he began, his voice even and low, "but the truth is, what brought us here wasn't written. It was lived, and that's the story I want to tell." He paused. The audience leaned in. "A few years ago, I boarded a plane to Zurich. I'd never left the country before. It was my first time on a plane, my first time in business class, my first step into a world I didn't think was meant for people like me. But that flight became something else entirely." He looked up, meeting the eyes of those who listened. There was a woman. She was elderly, frail. She'd been assigned a seat all the way in the back, but it was clear, so painfully clear, that she wouldn't make it there. No one moved, no one acted, and I didn't know what to do either, not really. I just stood up. I gave her my seat. He let the words sit there a moment, unadorned. I didn't know who she was. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was just a moment, a human moment, and I didn't expect it to mean anything beyond that. A breeze stirred the edge of the tent. The trees whispered gently around them. But she was someone. She was someone who had spent her life building, healing, restoring. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, that small act opened a door I didn't know existed. She gave me a chance to build something, not for myself, but for the kids I'd left behind in Atlanta. For the dreamers, the fighters, the ones who never get seen. He turned slightly, gesturing to the building behind him. "And this," he said, "is what grew from that." The crowd was quiet, many nodding, some wiping their eyes. "I'm telling you this," he continued, "because I want you to know that no act of compassion, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Sometimes giving up your seat can put you right where you were meant to be." He stepped away from the podium to a round of applause that was warm, sustained, but not roaring. It wasn't a stadium. It was a homecoming. As he returned to his place beside his mother, she squeezed his hand tightly. He didn't need to look at her to feel the depth of what passed between them. After the ceremony, people lingered. There were refreshments, tours of the new classrooms, laughter echoing through the hallways. Children darted around with backpacks bouncing. Teachers discussed schedules. Local journalists took photos. Elijah moved through it all humbly, answering questions, shaking hands, and stopping often to kneel beside a child with a question or a joke. Eventually, he found himself in the main classroom, now painted a rich, warm green, with skylights above and shelves filled with educational games, books, and robotics kits. On the far wall was a quote written in neat lettering above a framed photo of Dr. Holloway. "He reminded me who I still am." Elijah stood before it, hands in his pockets. He said nothing, but his silence was full of presence. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned and the sun began to fall toward the horizon, a young girl approached him. She wore her hair in thick braids and held a sketchbook to her chest. "Mr. Robinson?" she asked softly. He turned, kneeling slightly so their eyes met. "Yes?" She hesitated, then thrust the sketchbook toward him. "I drew something for the new hallway." He opened the book and saw it drawn in pencil, crude in technique but powerful in meaning. It was of a man standing beside a plane, reaching out to help an old woman step aboard. Behind them, children walked across a bridge made of light. He looked up, moved beyond words. "What's your name?" "Jasmine," she said. "It's beautiful, Jasmine," he said. "Really beautiful." She beamed, and he gently handed the book back. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she added shyly. He smiled softly, echoing a line he had spoken once before. "Don't be like me. Be better. Go farther." She nodded solemnly, then ran off to join her friends. That night, Elijah returned home to his modest apartment, its walls lined with books and photos and memory. He changed into a sweatshirt and jeans, made a cup of tea, and sat on the couch with his laptop open in front of him. The screen glowed softly as he composed an email to a new contact, a school district in Detroit interested in replicating the Holloway Center model. He wrote steadily, carefully, methodically. There was nothing rushed in his words. He knew now that real change was not born from flash but from steady, daily commitment. From waking up and choosing to give. From showing up again and again. When he finally closed the laptop, he reached for his jacket, still hanging from the back of a chair, and pulled from the inside pocket the card Dr. Holloway had given him. It was worn now, the edges soft, the script slightly faded. He read it once more and then, slowly, returned it to its place. Then, with deliberate calm, he stood, stepped out onto his small balcony, and looked out at the street below. On the corner, a young man waited for the bus, holding the hand of a younger sibling. An elderly woman pushed a cart of groceries. A group of boys raced past on bikes, laughter trailing behind them like wind. Elijah stood there, the breeze brushing against his face, the city humming beneath him. And he smiled, because he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives. Check out our other videos and be sure to share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching.